Good evening. This is Redwood Wonk. You're listening to us on KZZH, or you're watching us on Channel 12, or on the internet put together by Access Humboldt. I am here with Dave, and we will be talking the national issues of the day, and we will start with Joe Biden in Europe. He went there for three purposes on a trip. We'll talk about whether or not his trip was successful or how you even define that. But he went to the G7 meeting, the seven biggest economies that aren't China, basically, and the had a bunch of interactions there. We can talk about that, and we'll talk about his meetings with NATO, basically reinstating and reassuring NATO that, for instance, Article 5 will be honored, which Trump was saying he didn't necessarily know they would honor it. That basically states that one attack on one NATO nation is attack on all of them, and therefore a declaration of war against the entire alliance. Trump didn't know if he could support that, was pushing for other NATO people to pay more so that the United States could pay less into the defense. A lot of people thought that basically he was kowtowing to Putin on that whole thing because Putin had a hold on him. We've discussed that many times in the show. And then today he had a meeting with Putin, and we will talk about what, if anything, significant came out of that, and compare and contrast with the last president in terms of how this meeting went. Dave, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, certainly. So thanks for having me again this week. I really appreciate it. We have a lot of fun together, and we get to the bottom of things, which is kind of cool. So Biden's visit to Europe, I think that there's a few key, first cut things that I think are worth mentioning. One is that it's being labeled as a return to normalcy. Diplomatic and foreign policy norms are restored. We're not, as a country, people are saying we're not, waiting with bated breath for some awful thing to be said or done. And also, not just gaffes, but actually sometimes things that are actually harmful. So that's one of the things that's getting lots of coverage, and probably rightfully so, because Biden is in fact a statesman, has been in the Senate for decades. So big picture, that impacts the economy through G7. Also, it affects foreign policy and military issues, alliances through NATO. But I think it's worth, the one thing that I kind of want to add is I just am not hearing people talk about very much. But to me, it was a really serious signal for the scope and ambition of this administration and conceivably the entire U.S. foreign policy establishment that has agreed to roll this out. Is they're speaking of the Cornwall Consensus. So this meeting was held in the extreme, southwestern corner of England, and that area, that neighborhood there is called Cornwall. And what is this Cornwall Consensus? Well, they're saying that because it's an advisory memo that was written by representatives from each of the countries about a path towards greater equity and solidarity when it comes to health responses, data and technology, a whole set of responses to climate change. It's a grandiose, like I said, commitment, and the corollary, sort of the precursor to that, is known as the Washington Consensus. So many folks talk about, British economist John Williamson coined the phrase Washington Consensus to describe a collection of free market, pro-globalization ideas American leaders, and truthfully the whole G7, the whole world sort of seems to follow. That includes things like the World Bank, the IMF, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs that became the World Trade Organization. Why this matters to a domestic audience is because this memo then gets sent back to each of these member countries, and the leadership of those countries tries to get these commitments and these principles ingrained into law and practice. And as we know, the Washington Consensus really is pointing to the post-World War II New World Order that the United States was a lead partner in commitment with our special relationship with England and others of the G7. So not getting too deep into this, the fact that they are referring to it as a new Cornwall Consensus, I think kind of, we could talk about more, but it's in response to just where we are after the financial crisis of 2008, the confidence of crisis in institutions, the global reach of the whole Black Lives Matter movement, and a new awareness about equity, justice, dignity, and belonging. There's all sorts of things, not to mention climate change, drought, fires, and just the proper role of government and business in general in people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to your first point, the return to normality was a big theme in the narrative that the president wanted to do. He started with "America is back," and by that he means multilateralism, with America playing a leadership role in a lot of these issues as he see it. He received compliments and people saying they were relieved from every leader of the G7, including Boris Johnson, who's supposedly Trump's big buddy, right? And so it's at any rate, they did reach consensus. Specific things is a commitment to 1 billion vaccine doses being sent from what used to be termed the first world to what used to be termed the third world to less developed countries, with half of them coming from the United States. And they, this is a big commitment. Of course, people are going to say, well, why? What about America first? Well, of course, fewer and fewer people in America are getting vaccinated. We're probably reaching that point to where it's going to be hard to get that many more people anyway. It's not like we have a shortage of vaccines. We have a shortage of people willing to get them. So we might as well send it to where people will appreciate it, right? I mean, that's the theory. Anyway, we got that. Also talks about, of course, this isn't binding until the legislature of each country passes it, but minimum corporate tax of 15% to prevent capital flight. That's actually lower than ours right now. But corporations were just opposing it in principle. It's just they don't even want that. They want to be able to have move from one country to another. And this would mean of the 7 largest economies, no, can't do that. So at any rate, it's and a few other very tangible things that Biden could say he got out of the meeting. It's kind of putting to rest all of these claims that Biden is too senile to meet. He met with each and every leader, and seemed to be doing well speaking and all of that. I think that narrative is dying. You see it on social media, but he did accomplish those goals. And yes, he has restored and maybe moved a little bit away from neoliberalism to a sense that, government has a role to play, and there needs to be some social equity between the nations, and just even having that as the framework of discussion is a big move. That's something that probably would not have happened with another administration.
Right on. Yeah, I'm in agreement with that perspective, and I do want to pick up on what you said about the 15% corporate minimum tax. It is an incredibly important issue. It's hard to overstate how much the tax avoidance schemes and structures are literally the tail that wags the dog in the way that our global economic system is set up, and to a lesser extent, just the way private wealth is handled in general. And so the idea that there's territoriality where you're going to be paying 15% tax on profits in countries, there's lots of there's loopholes, potential galore. It's just a statement in principle that, as I say, devil's in the details. But just the idea, as a matter of perspective, many companies pay very close to zero tax because of how they're able to move money. Just one example is, Ireland, and it was a place where I think like Apple and some of the other tech companies are able to just have a massive amount of their revenue booked because of sweetheart deals they're able to make. There are offshore tax havens all over the place. So multinational corporations for now are the ones that are caught in this, referenced in this agreement. But the potential is there for over time to kind of just unpack all these tax avoidance schemes. One other thing, so that was one thing that I picked up on that you said, and another was, of course, we're talking about Biden meeting with Putin. So cybersecurity was another huge element of this G7 meeting. People now realize with the pipeline that was shut down, Colonial Pipeline, and the meatpacking plants. I mean, it's pretty regular that there are these cyber attacks. Everybody knows that who has experience working online or even socializing online. The security is a real issue and an incredibly dangerous threat. And so this is it's a moment where a line in the sand. I think there's been some degree of impunity. There's been some degree of what can be done about it, knowing that I'm not saying anything people don't already know. Countries like North Korea, China, Russia, others, they are host to a lot of these organized criminal elements or state-sponsored criminal elements, depending on the study and source of your research here. Where you reference where these efforts are coming from and who's working for whom. But I think it's really important that a big picture, our president, American president, has met with the Russian leader and kind of laid down the gauntlet. Things aren't simply, the critique, the criticism, the problems we're having, the conflict, theoretically, it's actually a Cold War ever since the annexation of Crimea and sections of Ukraine, as well as Russia being a bad actor or bad faith actor in countries like Libya and Syria. So when you realize that we have to have a strategic relationship with them, we have to make progress where we agree, but we have to draw serious differences with consequences. And I think that Biden and his team have made it pretty clear that that's the balance they're trying to seek.
Yeah, what Biden wanted to do, and there wasn't going to expect to be any agreements out of this thing. Putin was going to deny that there's his country is responsible for any cybersecurity. We knew that. What Biden avoided was the side-by-side press conference, which gives Putin gravitas. Biden wanted no part of that. That was something that Trump was more than willing to do. And then, but what they did get out of it was, again, there's going to be, first of all, a revival of the nuclear arms control talks, and that's vital. We need to really address that perennially, but we need to really address that. They will discuss cybersecurity. There's going to be an exchange of experts and the rest to talk about it. And apparently, Putin is probably worried, probably because some of the people who are criminally doing it could attack his infrastructure as well. It's not all from the government necessarily, and they're talking about Afghanistan and all of these other issues, and really what it was an agreement to talk. The ambassadors are going to be restored. They were all withdrawn over some things that happened earlier. But it was really just a step for Biden to assert himself, but also reopen dialogue. He didn't make threats. He just told Putin, we have cyber capabilities too. It wasn't a threat. It was just, a reminder. And, there was no blustering, but there was no being a sycophant either. It was standing up. Putin got what he needed out of it, but not necessarily the full press conference that he would have wanted. To be able to say, oh, we're all partners here. I'm standing up to him and we're equal partners, that type of thing, because Putin is basically holding on to, regime by power, by manipulating elections. I mean, we know that. And it's not even, it's it's not even something to debate. So it's just and he's jailed his opposition, possibly killing him health wise, and it's just it's really bad. It's a bad regime, and but they're powerful economically and militarily, so they have to basically they've got to talk with him and deal with him, and Biden, we think, at least I think, may have struck the right balance there.
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, William Jefferson Clinton, do solemnly swear.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear. So help me God.
All right, we've been discussing Senator Manchin for the past few weeks. He is, of course, in the news because he's pivotal. The Democrats need the 50 senators to be able to win, to be able to pass anything. And he has been under a lot of pressure because he said, I don't support the voter rights bill. I don't support, I want bipartisanship in the infrastructure bill, but the Republicans aren't really moving close enough to what make most Democrats happy. As we reported last week, 4 progressive House members signed a letter saying, if you remove too much stuff pertaining to climate change from the infrastructure bill, we won't vote for it. Manchin is dismissing that, saying, "Oh, they'll vote for it," but he will be the one that takes the blame for it, not them. And he understands that. And so he's starting to bend. He's being more critical of the Republicans lately. And today he offered his compromise voter rights bill. It has a number of things that are good. It doesn't have everything we really want. No gerrymander reform that I've seen, for instance, and that's going to be a big deal. I've got a prediction about that at the end of the show, by the way, about the gerrymandering. He does, and he does want to allow for states to mandate ID, but he wants a compromise to say it could be a utilities bill or something like that you carry that would do it rather than a photo ID. He is for an election holiday, which actually is interesting, and guaranteed 15 days of early voting, motor voter, and a bunch of things that the Democrats want. And if he's willing to do that, the question is he willing to override the filibuster for it, or push for a reform of the filibuster, which would make it much more difficult for Republicans to oppose this? And as I've said in the past, I actually support some form of a filibuster, but it's way too easy now, and I don't think a filibuster should be allowed to block debate. Maybe the ultimate vote, but not the debate. They need to put on, because people filibustering need to be put on, public notice, to be called out in public for it, and so that there are at least political consequences for that. I actually think that they should be required to do the old Jimmy Stewart thing of having to talk for hours and hours. I don't think it should have to be just a single person. You should be able to, hand it over to somebody else and all that. But if they're talking and talking and talking, and it's being covered on all the news, then it becomes a national dialogue, and then we learn from the American public possibly whether or not they support the filibuster, right? Something like that. It's just way too easy. Manchin has flirted with the idea of maybe altering it, making it a little bit harder. Will he do that in order to pass his version of the voting rights bill? Right now, the Republicans are saying they won't support that or the John Lewis bill or pretty much any voting reform. They want fewer voters. They've made that clear. They've said it openly at times. And Manchin and apparently Schumer is getting ready to pull the reconciliation process out for infrastructure, because there just isn't a lot of move from the Republicans. It's not actually clear as to what they would support as infrastructure. They have upped the amount of money, but this is that bipartisan 5 and 5 agreements, but they got to get agreements from enough Democrats in the House and enough Republicans in the Senate Will they do it? And, given that one senator today, I'm forgetting the name, said, let's just make it so that Biden has a 2-year term rather than a 4-year term, which is pretty much what McConnell said back in 2010. When he said that Obama would be a one-termer, didn't work out for him. So, at any rate, I'll give it to you. But Manchin is at the center. He's under a lot of pressure, and it does look like he's willing to move and not just look like an obstructionist. And what he proposes are certainly good things. Not everything the Democrats want, but maybe it's a compromise they can live with. I don't know. We'll see. I haven't seen a lot of responses to it yet.
Yeah, so it's the evolving story. I bet you, we never thought that Manchin would be at the center of so many conversations about how the entirety of the governance of our country would where we would be after Biden took office. But here we are. And so there's the veneer of bipartisanship, which I alluded to in a prior week, where I thought, if you look at an issue, a policy issue, like, for example, infrastructure on the merits, it's a no-brainer. You've got people in every community that would be receiving money. You've got a vast need. It's very difficult to imagine that it's, polling Pew and Gallup and others. It's hugely popular that we invest in the country. So the question is the strategy for Republicans to pay lip service to this bipartisanship, while in fact continuing that path dependency of obstructing everything going back over a decade, and it's hard to have any kind of optimism that it's anything significant going on. But we are talking about Manchin here, not the Republicans, and so the question is, is he negotiating in good faith? And while I haven't had a chance to really, look too closely at it, I have been told through friends that The Intercept just dropped today a leaked Zoom teleconference that Manchin participated in. He's very popular these days, of course.
Yes.
By a group called No Labels, which is co-founded by former Senator Joe Lieberman, who is a conservative Democrat. And not to call them out, there's all sorts of big money groups, but this is one where there's an audio Zoom call with, the principals involved, who they are, where they sit. And the purpose of this group is to funnel high net worth donor money to conservative Democrats and moderate Republicans. So there is a constituency out there for bipartisanship, and it's the billionaire class and the multimillionaire fundraising groups out there. I can't say for sure if it will result in anything that is actually a break of the logjam, but it seems pretty clear from what I've been told that they are very strongly in favor of keeping the filibuster, because that is power. That's the way. It's the agenda-setting mechanism that prevents all sorts of things from happening after that. So where does Manchin play? What's his role here? He can say, "Look, I can make it or break it." So he really does have that key position. But it sounds like what he's doing is he's outwardly saying one thing and inwardly saying another. I'll look at that. I'll look at that in more detail. We could follow up on it in future weeks.
He does not want to be so obstructionist that he is basically labeled a Republican, because, okay, he'll get himself reelected in West Virginia, but if none of the Democrats want to work with him, if Democrats actually increase the Senate and they don't need him, he'll be out in the cold. So he's got to be kind of careful about that. But he is the new Lieberman. It's interesting you mentioned Joe Lieberman was the founder of this, because Lieberman is the reason we don't have a public option in ACA. He was the one who said at the last minute, no, I won't support that. Of course, he was in Connecticut, where he was from. That's where half the insurance companies are based. And they absolutely do not want a public option, because they don't want to compete for it. Because, if you have to compete with a public agency, it's always sort of a contradiction. Oh, we want the free market because it performs better, but we can't compete with a public option. That just doesn't make any sense. But that was basically what he said. He said he would veto it. They had exactly 60 Democrats to be able to override it. Imagine if they had 60 Democrats now, and even with Manchin, so that is unfortunately Republicans don't. Well, I take that back. Republicans do have a few people like that if they were in charge who get in the way of things. But Manchin is key here because he's the story. He's the center of attention. But I'm not sure he's wanting to be the center of attention the way he's been, and that's why I think he might be proposing this bill and saying, and if the Republicans aren't going to go along with that, well, then I guess I'm going to have to go with my fellow Democrats on this. But will there be some type of filibuster reform that comes in order to pass it? Because he does not want to go down in history as the safeguarding of the new Jim Crow.
Makes perfect sense, and there's a refinement, I guess, of his position. A refined element of his position is he also doesn't want to be the guy that, or is apparently does not want to be that person who overturns the tradition of the filibuster.
Right.
But really, that just means you keep the filibuster and you can reform it. And there's innumerable ways you can reform it. So, for example, when it went from 67 to 60, that's a tweak of the rule, and that makes it a little bit easier for things to pass. Also, we've talked about before how they made an exception for federal judges, and then they made an exception for Supreme Court judges.
Right.
So they're able to just sort of carve out line item exemptions from filibuster requirement as well, and that may be you started this segment. There you go. You started this segment off mentioning voting rights bill, right? So that is a massively huge issue, particularly in light of the fact that states, and even since we talked last week, states have passed even more laws that are taking us down a road that I don't think anybody ever thought we would go. I highly doubt there's broad-based support in the Congress for things like what some of these states are passing to lower the turnout. But the flip side of that is that in this, the Senate version of the voting reform bill, the For the People Act, there are restrictions or even outright bans on dark money. So I hate to use this cliche. I won't even use it. I won't use that cliche. But one of the key elements of any political consultancy and or special interest group is money and how they fund these elections. So publicly funding elections is an element that they absolutely do not want to pass.
Right.
So it's easy right now to say I'm against these bills, but it's very hard to say why. And if it's like, well, I really don't want the federal government to review former states that abused their minority population through their voting, like you said, Jim Crow, and some of these same states are now passing these laws. It just makes sense that you can't say, oh, the reason I don't want to pass this bill is because it's not necessary. These states are going to be good faith actors. There's no way they would roll back voting access because they already are. And you could say the same thing about dark money. You can't say, oh, we don't need publicly funded elections or we don't need some sort of dark money reform. The Supreme Court, ever since Citizens United, it's been a whole host of evidence put forward about why there's too much money in politics. It's too influential, and it really is an anti-democratic, small d, attempt to write laws, for the donor class.
Quickly before we go to the next topic, I want to actually point out I support the reform and getting rid of dark money and overturning Citizens United on principle, but I think money is actually having less and less impact because it used to be television advertisements. That's what you did. You had access to television, radio, all of that, but everything's online now, and online is cheaper. And social media, every campaign now has basically a social media strategy committee, and that's where stuff is being won and lost. Hillary Clinton spent a lot more money than Trump did in his campaign, because Trump, every time he opened his mouth, got instant media coverage, right? I mean, there's media campaigns, there's social media campaigns, and it looks like being able to spread memes around Facebook and other social media seems to have a bigger effect than even the best of television ads, which, there used to be some great television ads that affected the elections, like in 1964, the famous Daisy, nuclear bomb ad, Reagan, the bear in the woods with a Native American standing up to him. I mean, there have been a lot of really effective ads, to the Willie Horton racist ads that Bush used against Dukakis. I mean, it is effective, but I don't know that it's that effective anymore, because, nobody under 60 watches television anymore, right? I mean, it's really, so we'll see. And that was the big money item. You could just flood the airwaves, but there's so many different sources now.
I would love to push back a little bit on that because, and I agree with you in principle, and that's true. I've said for a long time that it really is about the message, less so than the money. But money buys speech, and so whether it's on traditional media like regular mainstream television, radio, or social media online, there's still money involved. And so if you look at like Facebook, Google, and Twitter, I think, if I remember correctly, those three entities represent over 50% of all of the advertising funding in America. And so when we see social media messaging for political reasons, it jumps up to like 70 plus, right. Nearly 80%.
We will come back to that another time, David. We'll have that, continue that discussion. It's a very important one. But that moves us to the next topic.
I don't think I've made mistakes. I mean, every time somebody says I made a mistake, they do the polls and my numbers go up. So I guess I haven't made any mistakes.
We showed up and we demonstrated that we would not have our voices silenced by a Republican Party that across the country had a singular intention on suppressing the right to vote.
Some Democratic senators seem to imagine they could just break the rules on a razor-thin majority. Nothing would stand between them and their entire agenda, a new era of fast-track policymaking.
The Republican Party moved very far away from reality. And the fact that you got colleagues of mine in the Senate who refuse even today to acknowledge that Donald Trump lost the election. How do you deal with that?
Joe Biden is the president we need right now. Battle-tested, forward-looking, honest, and authentic. He has never forgotten who he is fighting for.
Okay, Juneteenth. Looks like it has passed both houses of Congress. Juneteenth is going to be a national holiday because Biden is expected to pass it and to sign it. And basically, June 19th, for those who aren't aware, is considered to be the last date upon which slaves learned about the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed during the war. But it was, years before it got down. And finally, when Union soldiers reached the west part of Texas or something like that and informed the last of the slaves that they were no longer slaves, it has been a traditional informal holiday for a long time. It has been passed. So some Republicans did vote against it. I don't think any Democrats did. But it passed in the majority, no filibuster in the Senate. Seems, even though Republicans have been, upset, they don't like the 1619 project. Mitch McConnell even went as far as to say 1619 isn't all that important a date in American history. That's the year that the African slave trade was brought to the colonies. So they want to downplay it. There's a big backlash of Republicans against critical race theory. If you were to actually ask them, what do you even mean by critical race theory? They'd be hard pressed to tell you, but they oppose it anyway. But they did come together and sign this. Maybe this is a show of bipartisanship, or maybe the politics are such that they couldn't afford to do it. Well, it's being compared to the Martin Luther King holiday, which is actually a day off, federal. But there were people who opposed that, right and left. Interesting enough, left, the last senator to oppose it was McCain, considered a centrist, but in Arizona it was very unpopular. They didn't recognize it for a long time. Because back then, a lot of Republicans and a lot of conservatives understood that Martin Luther King wasn't just a civil rights activist; he was an anti-war activist and a socialist, basically, and a union activist. In fact, he started getting into unionization. Some people say that might be why he was killed. But anyways, that there was a lot of opposition. Now Martin Luther King is farther back. And he's, the farther you get away from him, the less dangerous he is, and the more sterilized you can make it. So I guess the argument is, does the passage of the holiday for Juneteenth mean anything, or is it just an opportunity for Republicans to say, see, I care about race issues? I don't know, but it is a significant moment in American history, no matter what, and no matter what the politics behind it. And Dave?
Yeah, it's very significant in our nation's history. It's been celebrated for 100 and whatever, 60 years now. Some people call it Freedom Day. Some people call it Emancipation Day. But it's been celebrated nationwide, and in fact, globally. All over the world, people acknowledge it. There are people that acknowledge it, rather, not everybody, of course. But it's hugely important Celebration Day, and the fact that it's been bipartisanly approved on a bipartisan basis by both houses, it's a historic moment in our history. Is it a gesture of bipartisanship that has traction beyond the day? I don't think it is, but that doesn't diminish it in any way. And in fact, we now have at least some common ground about the fact that George Floyd's passing at the hands of at the knee, actually, of a police officer on national television, that everybody shared that moment, and it galvanized our, I think, collective commitment to humanity. And how it manifests itself over time, we shall see. But at least for now, we know that there's going to be a day on our calendar forever where we could reflect on this and have a shared moment of history. It's one of those things that I didn't think it was going to pass the way it did, and I'm very thankful. And it does engender some degree of hope that we could find common ground on things that maybe a year ago we wouldn't have.
Right. I mean, certainly it will provide Republicans with the opportunity when they're defending their, support of Jim Crow anti-voting laws to say, well, I vote for the Juneteenth holiday, right? I'm not a racist. So, it will have that aspect of it, but it's worth it. We need to have recognition of this, and because, the people are going to see the headline, and a lot of people who don't know what Juneteenth was, is, what it represents, will learn that part of the history. And, they say, what was it? Ambrose Bierce said, war is America's way of teaching, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. Well, passing bills like this is a way to teach history, and things that, we have lost. It comes on the heels of the massacre, in Oklahoma that we've been talking about, and a lot of education, and it's making it more difficult for people to be racist. And I've noticed that there's even a change, like Representative Green. We all know she's kind of crazy, but she went to the Holocaust Museum and then held a press conference saying, wow, turns out the Holocaust was really a bad thing, right? But just the fact that she has to say that, maybe there's some people in her following that'll say, oh gosh, maybe I should learn about the Holocaust. What is the Holocaust? I mean, it's really that bad in some places. And so with that, the more it is an indication of a shift in the political climate as well. So I'm optimistic about that, as well as the historical and symbolic significance.
So just to touch very briefly, on the fact that you said it's a shift in the political climate, we can't underestimate or understate how much of a shift. Like you said, the Black Wall Street massacre in Tulsa in 1921. As recently as last year, I would say a huge segment of the population had no idea. There's the show Watchmen that is credited with actually bringing it to folks' attention, surprisingly. But it's true. It's one of those things that it isn't taught, and maybe that's a conversation for another time, or at least hasn't been taught widely. But now has been a teaching moment. In fact, President Trump did change his rally date from the 19th. I think he delayed by a day, just because he maybe had no idea, or maybe thought it was a politically expedient provocation that at some point they said, actually, the wisdom here is to just change it by a day and don't be that guy. And maybe in that one case, at least that's one example where we could see that he was sensitive to it, to making that change. And I think it's possible, just to comment on what you said about Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I know this is going to sound very crass, but she did engage in hyperbole, where she compared wearing a mask to atrocities of that nature. Yeah. She did probably go into the museum and see all of the halls and all the exhibits and photos and said, oh my goodness, I see piles of dead people, like thousands and thousands of bodies piled up because of an atrocity by the government. Maybe me having to wear a mask or my friends having to wear masks is not quite morally equivalent to that. And it clicked. So thank goodness for small miracles.
Yeah. Anyway, well, no, it's true, and it is a pretty good indication of how the political wind has shifted on some of the issues when Trump actually has to voluntarily do something he doesn't want to do. It takes a lot to do that, So it's just it is an indication of where we're at, and maybe things are changing, and maybe there'll be a counter backlash to the backlash against critical race theory. Again, people don't. Define the term, and before you oppose something, learn what it is, because it's it's teaching that white people are responsible for what their ancestors did. It's like, no, it's not. To state that they benefit from it is not to state that they're responsible for it. There is no theory that they could go back in time and have influenced their ancestors to create a system of privilege that they benefit from. Nobody's saying that. That's stupid. But that is exactly what they're saying is being said. All right, the final topic of the evening, bipartisanship. Of course, there's a lot of talk about bipartisan. Biden promised to be bipartisan. He wanted to be bipartisan. Manchin is pushing for bipartisanship in the infrastructure bill and a lot of the other bills, and the voting rights bill. And so they're engaging in these long talks with Republicans that seem to make some progress. And they said, okay, we've got a tentative agreement, for an infrastructure bill, the 10 people from each bipartisan commission, but nothing's happened on it. Democrats aren't happy with it. Republicans aren't happy with it. So, and some people are like saying, Biden came out real strong, pushed the first pandemic relief bill through without bipartisanship, and they want him to do it with infrastructure as well. Two reasons Biden might not want to do it. He does want to be known as the bipartisan president, but he also does not want to make the same mistakes Obama made, who was obsessed with trying to get Republicans to like him and go along with him, and it took them forever to realize it wouldn't matter if it was a bill they wrote. Like Obamacare actually came from a conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, and probably would have passed it if it was a Republican president, but they did not want to vote for it because Obama. It took them a long time until, unfortunately, after the Democrats lost the Senate majority, before he realized that's not going to happen. Ocasio-Cortez is saying, tweeted, she says, we're losing time here. This obsession with bipartisan isn't going anywhere. It's not a bill that we like, and basically McConnell's running out the clock. We're allowing them to do that. in response, Schumer, as I mentioned earlier in the show, is setting up for a reconciliation bill and may even be pushing to ignore the parliamentarians' declaration that that you can only have 2 a year. But we'll see what happens with that. But to what, and it would be nice if we have bipartisanship. We obviously got it with the Juneteenth bill. Today also, they passed a resolution to give medals to some of the officers who defended the Capitol. 21 Republicans voted against giving medals to the people who maybe saved their asses. I mean, it boggles the mind. But we can't get it. It passed. There's no filibuster of it or anything like that. But the question is there any point to bipartisanship right now, or pressing for it? Again, it would be nice, but it doesn't seem like the Republicans are interested. It seems like the Democrats are always going out of their way, and then they don't get it, and then they lose the time to not pass what it is they need to pass. They got to deal with Manchin, obviously, but is there any point to trying to be bipartisan with the Republicans on any issue of contention?
Yeah, there's a lot there, and it's a rhetorical question, but the consequences are going to be eternally important for us. The bills that are being talked about, being put forward, besides the COVID relief bill that's already passed, there are some of the largest, most ambitious bills in our lifetime, and so there really are consequences for decades. So the question is, if you, again, I hate to be a broken record on this, but if you look at the path dependency of the choices of the Republican leadership, they have said out loud and voted in practice, exhibited behavior in practice, that there's very little that they want to pass, that they are not interested in giving whether it was the Obama administration or this administration for that matter, they don't want to give any ground based on power. They have the power to deny, for example, Supreme Court justices, and they do it. They have the power to block infrastructure bill, and they do it. So the flip side of this is, do the Democrats listen to chair of the Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, and her team, and their guidance that you have these priorities? You want to say, if we are talking about I keep mixing JFK, a FDR moment. If this is truly an FDR moment where we are going to transition and pivot from the path of history towards something more ambitious, then it's not going to be done. Apparently, it's not going to be done through conventional means. So the question is, will the Democratic Party's progressive representatives in the House be able to say no to their team and say, look, we don't want a half measure infrastructure bill, for example. We want all of it. And will Joe Biden's inclination towards bipartisanship, will he be able to suspend that and say, I did make an overture. History will absolve me to a certain extent. Not that he's Castro, but history will show. The records will show. We tried, and there was just not a good faith actor on the other side.
Exactly. I mean, that's what he wants to do. I mean, he's actually kind of redefined bipartisanship. He says, well, the bill I support has 78% support or whatever it was. I forget what bill it was. That's pretty bipartisan, defining it as, what Republican voters would like as opposed to what Republicans in office would like. If he's going to expand bipartisanship to that and claim bipartisanship, and maybe he's got a good argument that that's the best way to define it, then that's fine. But, he's got that slim, majority in the Senate, and that is a big deal. So it's Manchin who has to get over the obsession of bipartisanship, and he may be getting tired of it. We already talked about him. I don't want to talk too much more about that, but the concept is you got 2 years guaranteed. We don't know what's going to happen in 2022. I've got a prediction about 2022, but we don't know what's going to happen in 2022. He may lose one or both the houses. They can't afford to lose any ground, really. 4 votes. Well, actually, after August, it'll be 5 votes. There's another person who's going to win, but I think it's from Arizona, a Democrat. I think I got the state wrong, but the Republican governor is putting it off as long as possible. So there will be a 5-person majority, but that's razor thin because there are a bunch of swing districts, and we'll talk about that. But the what is the utility of it now? When you have got a party, Republican Party, that basically is losing ground with voters, across the country, they're getting. I mean, Republicans have won 1 majority for presidential race in the past 7 elections, and that was Bush against Kerry in 2004. Every other election, beginning with Clinton in 1992, the Democrats have won more votes than the Republicans, and that's not going to change, so the Republicans are feeling like we've got to block everything now, hope that the Supreme Court will save us later, because they've locked in a Supreme Court majority, barring some tragedies for years. So they don't see an incentive in bipartisanship because they'll just see that as a slippery slope that they're losing ground on. And not only that, but bipartisanship is not a premium with the Trump base. They don't want bipartisanship. They don't even, Trump people. They don't even like the Republican Party. Trump is what they support. They support Republicans because Trump is a Republican. It is the aspect of the movement, and it does not favor compromise. It sees strength in standing up to the way things are and the bureaucracy. And unfortunately, that's a very authoritarian concept and very dangerous one in politics. And so it's sad, but Democrats have to realize they've got 2 years. And they can't really be wasting time. I agree with Ocasio-Cortez. They got to get some stuff through and then, worry about bipartisan for the next 2 to 6 years. All right, Dave, what do you got for a prediction or two?
A prediction or two. Okay. Well, so one of the things that I've heard, one of the let's say that again. Some of the feedback that I've heard about Biden's trip focuses on a couple of times that he may have misspoken here or there, with minimal impact. It's really folks that are hyper scrutinizing, I think, his fitness and mental acuity. And I would say that that's a relatively cheap shot and not productive in any way. So what I think is that this massive basically trench warfare that exists, this schism of absolute distrust, mistrust, and lack of faith, goodwill between groups, whether it's the left and the right or the moderates and the progressives. I think that so much of that is a habit that we will be able to get past with the exhibition of effective leadership. So my prediction is that this 2022 election cycle that's going to roll out in the next 6 months will give every actor, every political entity out there the opportunity to reframe, readjust, realize that it's time for us to think about the important things to families and people out there, and that we ought to look at the things that we agree on already and find a path towards that set of shared values that Biden's talking about on this NATO trip, on this trip to the G7, on this trip to Russia. We do have shared values that we agree on. We don't agree on everything. In fact, we don't agree on most things, but there are things that we agree on. And my prediction is that this election cycle, we will actually have people making that case.
All right. Well, my prediction, I'm going to go forward usually I try to predict something closer in time, but I've been really studying this question of what's going to happen in 2022 with regard to the House in particular. Of course, the conventional wisdom is the party in power as president always loses seats on the first term after they're elected. It's not true. There have been a number of exceptions to that. One of them, 2002, George Bush the Republicans actually gained, probably because of the attack on 9/11 and the war and in the political climate of the time. This is likewise an anomalous situation. We've got Trumpism that just breaks all rules. For a couple of reasons. I'm going to go into it in more detail in the future show, but I don't think as many Trumpers are going to show up. 2018 showed us that a lot of Trumpers don't show up if Trump is not on the ballot. And anti-Trump voters are motivated, especially if everything's been blocked, and the Democrats haven't been able to make strides, and if there's an attempt to suppress the vote. But I'm also looking at gerrymandering, and I want to look at this in more detail because, yes, the Republicans have total control in 23 states, right? And they're going to be able to gerrymander those, but they're maxed out gerrymandered now. Utah, you've got 4 districts in there that all send tin-rolls into Salt Lake City to make sure that there isn't even one congressional vote for a Democrat, but the one that is mostly within the suburbs. It sometimes goes to Democrats, sometimes doesn't, and they can't get any more than they have now. They've got 4; they can't get any more than 4. Alabama, they put all of the black voters into one district. It looks like an octopus that stretches from Birmingham back over to the western part of the state and then into Montgomery, so that there are 6 Republican districts and only 1 Democratic district. They can't do any more than that. 30% of the vote is black. They can't shut it down, so they can't gain anywhere there. In Georgia and Texas, they have more, but the metropolitan areas are growing, and it's going to make it harder for them to do more. They may even lose ground there, even gerrymandering. Anyway, I want to discuss this for another show, but I am going to predict now that the Democrats retain the House and even expand their vote in their representation in 2022, and we will be discussing this in future shows. All right. Well, that concludes the show. I want to thank Matt Knight at Access Humboldt for making all this possible. Again, we will be back next week, with the news of the day. And I think plenty is going to happen. Until next time, keep thinking.